morning. All right, you get to hear me again. Aren't you excited?
Yeah.
Right now, I kind of feel like a fitness instructor. So we're going to do some exercise and some calisthenics this morning. I'm just kidding. Or Britney Spears. I don't know how I feel right now with this thing on my head. It's not my normal, let's put it that way. This morning, I'm also preaching from Acts 16. Just kidding. That's a joke. The last 3 sermons have been from Acts 16, so I figured I'd throw a 4th one in there. Not really, though. I'm actually going to the Old Testament today. Ooh, dangerous. And we're going to be coming out of 2 Kings chapter 4. That's going to be kind of the context of our sermon for this morning. But I'm going to give you kind of a quick story here. One time when I was in high school, and this thing's really catching my breathing, isn't it? It might be that I'm just out of breath from that first song still. While I was in high school, there was, I lived in the upstate in a little town called Lyman, South Carolina. Lyman and Duncan. I went to Burns High, so if any of you know what James F. Burns High School is, I'm sorry that we beat you in football a lot. Not when I was in high school, we were terrible. But one morning on the way to school, I realized that my gas tank was empty, right? It was running on empty, but I think I was probably running late for school. So I was like, I'm gonna get to school, and we'll deal with it on the way home because there's a gas station. I drive by at least 3 of them on the way home, okay? So I get in my car after school. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind is that where Lyman and Duncan is, it's the foothills, right? And it's real hilly. And from the underclassmen parking lot to my house, about 1/3 of that is straight up this massive hill, okay? Now remember, I'm running on empty here. So I'm thinking, I'm praying, Lord, just let me get to a gas station. I know where it's at. I got to get there. So I'm making it up the hill, and suddenly my car begins to do the empty tank shuffle. You know what I'm talking about? And I'm getting a little panicky because I am not quite to the top of the hill yet. But when I get to the top, it cuts off. And I'm like, oh man, I've still got a stoplight, and I got to turn right and then turn left into the gas station, which is right there. Fortunately, it is a little bit of a downhill from there. The only thing that was going to stand in my way was whether or not that red light determined to turn red, and if I was going to have to break the law. Fortunately, the light stayed green. I rolled down the hill, praying the whole way, turned right, and I was able to turn right into the gas station, pull right up to a pump. And that was it. And I was like, whew, I made it. But man, my car was running on empty, wasn't it? Have you ever been on empty? Have you ever been in a place in your life where you felt like you had nothing left? Where you had spent your last drop of energy and you were in a hopeless, bottomless pit? You ever been there? Now, granted, an empty tank isn't necessarily the bottom, right? But it illustrates the point of being empty and what can happen when you're running on empty. In 2 Kings 4, we read about a widow who is empty, right? Her husband recently died, and she was deep in debt, and the creditors that she owed were coming for their money. And one of the ways that they paid their debts was to enslave people. So her sons were going to be taken by the creditors as slaves to work off the debt that she owed. Worst of all, in those days, widows weren't really allowed to do much work, right? So there wasn't a way for her to just do some work to pay off her debt. Her sons were going to have to do it for her. So she was arguably in a very empty, low place in her life. And that's why today's message is titled Running on Empty. So the first thing, let's just read through that little incident. And it's Elisha, who had been appointed by Elijah to replace him. So that's who's taking the role of the prophet in this. So let's just read there. Verse 1. A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slaves." So Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go, borrow vessels from everywhere, from all of your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons, then pour it into all those vessels, and set aside the full ones." So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another vessel." So the oil ceased. Then she came and she told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest." It's tough being in that kind of place where you feel like you have nothing left. When Sherry and I were in our first year and a half or so of marriage, I decided I would go back to school. I was going to get some classes on worship ministry, so I was going to go up to North Greenville. My dad was a campus minister there. It was tuition. I figured I can't pass up on this opportunity. So we went up there. We moved in with my parents. Note to you, never, ever, if you can avoid it, move in with your parents. I love my parents, but it's just not the same, especially after you've been married for a little while, and I haven't been home, living at home for quite a number of years, so it was just like, not your place. About halfway through the first year, or through that year of my schooling, Sherry got pregnant with Riley. You ruined everything. I'm just kidding. I'm not blaming you, baby. No, she didn't ruin everything, but I was working part-time at a warehouse, and Sherry was working full-time at Ann Taylor in the mall. And so I was like, okay, we can still do this. She's pregnant, that's cool. We can still do this. We're living at my parents' house. The bills aren't too bad. About 3/4 of the way through my second semester, Sherry was getting pretty sick. She was working retail, so she's on her feet all day long, and she was one of the store managers, and so she had to be there a lot. But they weren't very giving to her when it came to feeling sick, and she had requested that she be given numerous times throughout the day that she could sit down for a few minutes to kind of, get the sickness off, right? But they wouldn't work with her. So we made the hard decision that she was going to quit her job, and that we're still living with my parents. I'm still got my part-time job. We can still cover our bills. Because while we didn't have food and whatnot, we still had car insurance, car payment, student loans, you name it. We still had some bills. About a month after that, my warehouse decides they're downsizing, and I'm the lowest man on the totem pole, so they said bye. Now we're both unemployed, living with my parents, and still have debt, and we're having a child in 6 months, and I'm getting a little panicky, as you can imagine. I tried to find work. I tried everything. This was 2007, so it's getting right there close to the big crash, the economy. So people weren't just jumping at the bit to hire people, and I was doing school, and so they just knew that I was just a temporary person anyway. And so they weren't really big on hiring me, and we were having a really hard time just finding something. Well, out of the blue, my uncle, who's a youth evangelist, calls me. He says, "Hey, Brad, for the summer, June, July, August, and part of September, I'm traveling around between North Carolina and West Virginia, and I'm doing these summer camps, week long, and I need a worship guy. Are you available?" And I said, let me look at my calendar, and I'll get back to you. And then I was like, it's free. Well, what do you know? I said, which is good timing, because I lost my job, and so is Sherry. And he paid us enough for that summer, or he paid me enough for that summer to cover all of our bills and get us through part of the fall, up to the point where Riley was born, which we had to do the thing I didn't want to do, which was to go on government assistance as well, which is difficult, especially for a prideful man like me, that you have to go and you have to ask for help. And that it just was not the place I wanted to be in. But during that summer, I met a pastor in the first week of summer camps. And he's like, hey, I'm looking for a worship guy. Are you interested? I was like, sure. I'm really unemployed right now, so I'll take a look at least, and we can talk. And it opened up a dialogue. And by November, I had taken the job in North Carolina. And that's where we met Jonathan and Monica Hamlet, which, if you guys remember, he used to play the keys for us. So all of that led me to North Carolina, which eventually brought me here. In a moment of despair, when it seemed like Sherry and I were going to have the creditors beating on our doors, fortunately we didn't have any kids born yet, so they weren't going to come take those, God provided. He didn't just fill us for that moment, though. He opened a door in that moment that would fill us for years to come. And that's exactly what he did for the widow. You see, her story illustrates my first point, which is, in order to be filled, you have to be empty. Think about that. In order to be filled, you have to be empty. God wants to bless us, right? He wants to fill us. But in order to be filled, in order to be blessed, we have to be empty. You can't fill something that's already full. Makes sense, right? You can't put something in the space where something's already occupying. It's going to require that we empty ourselves of the things that occupy God's place in our lives. So what are some of the things that we fill our lives with instead of God? I've got 5 things, and I'm sure there's plenty more than that, but these are just 5 things that came to my mind when I was thinking about what do we fill up our lives with instead of God. So number 1, careers. We all have to work. We need to support ourselves. We need to support our families, okay? But how often do people become so obsessed with climbing that corporate ladder that it literally consumes their life? I know some people, it's so funny because at Blackbaud, they get so frustrated with me. Because I see it, this is just a job. I'm taking care of my family. I'm a minister. And this is really more like a tent-making job for me. And they're like, so what do you think about the future here at Blackbaud? I'm like, as long as I'm getting paid and I've still got insurance. And they're like, you have no interest in a future path? And I'm like, yeah, the path of just keeping money in my bank account. These are my goals. It's not a career for me, okay? It is a tent-making job. But there are others I know at Blackbaud who their every single decision and move is like playing chess. And so they're thinking down the road, okay, now if I do this and I send this email and I include this certain person and they see what I'm doing, well, they just might get impressed. And next thing you know, I've moved up the next rung. And it becomes their obsession. And you can tell when their job is an obsession and God isn't the one filling it because they're so concerned about losing their job. My coworker, he is so scared to lose his job that he is literally consumed by the thought of losing his job. It's a daily thing. He's like, every time he sends an email and he did something wrong, he's like, oh man, I'm probably going to get fired for that. And I'm like, you need to calm down, man. But some people are like that, and there's nothing wrong with having a job, but when that particular thing takes over and fills the place of God, that's a problem. Number 2, friends. Some of us have lots of friends. That's not me. Some of us have a few friends. That's me. Friends are great, okay? Don't get me wrong. Friends are great. And it's good that we can have people that we can confide in. There's people that we can talk to that are in the same area of life as us, right? But there are people who make their friends their life. I used to be that way. Friends defined me. Not necessarily how many friends I had, but what kind of friends I had. In high school, I was in the band, so I needed to figure out how to make my reputation a little better, right? So I had to friend people like football players and jocks and other more popular, richer kids than I was. I was the preacher's kid. I needed something to help give me a boost. And it became an obsession to the point that it caused me to stumble as a Christian. Now, I've been saved since I was 7. But in high school, my friends and their opinion of me became more important than God's expectations of me. And I began to set his expectations for me aside so that I could impress my friends with whatever it was they were being impressed with. I'll tell you that not a single one of those people are my friends today. They are on Facebook, but that doesn't count, no. Sorry, anybody who that's what you gauge your friends level with. Number 3, family. I come from a family of 5. I am the oldest of 3 children. My wife comes from a family of 7. She is the oldest of 5 daughters. Family's great. You can't pick your family. Sometimes family can be not so great. They can be frustrating. You can't get away from them, especially at holidays. But what happens when we begin to place our family time over our God time? What happens when we elevate our children above our spouses, or worse, our God? We have I would say, and I don't know what it was like before me and before our generation, so I'm just speaking from my perspective. But there is a rampant issue in my generation of child worship. Now, it's funny because we also have a rampant issue with abortion. So we don't have a problem killing the unborn, but when they're born, holy cow. Don't you talk about my child. Don't you dare say my child did something wrong. Don't you dare get up in my face. We worship our children. And I'm just speaking from my generation. I can't speak for any other generation. But we worship our children. Their desires and wants take precedence. They begin to rule the home. It's a scary thing. And we love our families. Don't get me wrong. We need to love our children. I love my kids. And so it's no wonder that because we do love them, that they can end up quickly taking the place of God. And I think a lot of the problem, and this is again, this is free. This isn't part of my notes here. But I think a lot of the problem for why we do that is we're making up for our own childhood. And maybe some of us, so we grew up in the 90s. Most of us, some of us. And, you know, our parents came out of a generation, they were the 60s babies and the 50s babies, right? The boomer, whatever they're called. I don't know what they're called. And that was the free love period, right? And we saw a generation that began to, divorce rates started going through the roof. You know, and we're seeing this, right? And we don't want our kids, my generation does not want our kids to go through what we went through. Now, I, fortunately, didn't experience divorce with my parents until I was an adult. But as a kid, I can tell you right now that I could look at a room of students that I was in with, and probably 3 or 4 out of 5 were from divorced homes. And 98% of statistics are made up on the spot. I'm just saying in general, though, I can look at my friends when I was in high school, and I can tell you they were either from broken homes, divorced homes, and when we became adults and we got children of our own, we didn't want that to become what they went through, and we overcompensated. And because we overcompensated, we put our children in the wrong order. We put them above our spouses. We put them above our God. We put them above ourselves. And don't get me wrong, again, we love our children, but they are not idols to be worshiped, but that's what they've become. And I think that's a dangerous thing for our children, because they're being taught the wrong order. So when they become parents, man, I can only imagine. Number 4, material things. You know, we need a place to live. We need a car. Well, maybe not as a car, but we need transportation, right? It could be a bicycle, moped, motorcycle, four-wheeler, whatever. We need transportation to get from one place to the other. We need money to buy food, to pay for insurance, to buy that house and that car. We need clothes. We need clothes. We need. We have all these needs. And you know, it's funny. I think the fact is a lot of our needs are actually wants. Sometimes our need is just to keep up with the Joneses next door. Sometimes our need is there because it makes us feel successful. Perhaps we want it just because we want it, because we're just obsessed with stuff. And hear me when I say this, stuff will not fill you. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 6. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Too many people are investing in material things because they think it's going to fill that hole, that gap. And I'm just here to tell you it's not. They're not going to have a U-Haul behind your hearse. You're going to the grave empty-handed. That's not to say that things are bad, okay? Don't get me wrong. Having these things are not bad. But when our life's obsession, our core, our being is wrapped around having stuff, and we've officially dethroned God and we put those as idols on his throne. And finally, number 5, ourselves. Ooh. Hey, look, it's not a bad thing to want to take care of yourself. You know, some of us take care of ourselves better than others. Sherry takes care of me well. I eat well at home. We have wants, we have desires, we have needs, we have dreams. But when our desires overshadow the needs of others, or when we become so full of ourselves that we become unteachable, and we become hard, and we become gods in our minds, then we're in a dangerous place. And I would say probably ourself is the first thing that's going to take the place of God. Almost every time. And that's called selfishness. And it's a dangerous place. So how can we possibly expect to be filled with God when we fill ourselves with nothing else, or with everything else, sorry. Don't misunderstand me. Again, careers are good. Taking care of your family is good. Friends are good. Family can be good. Material things can be good. But when anything becomes the central point of our life, when we become consumed by things other than God, we are filling ourselves with a different God. We have to empty ourselves. We have to dethrone these other gods if we're expecting God to take his rightful place and fill us. Elisha could have just given the widow what she wanted or needed. But that's not how it went down. Instead, Elisha asks what she has in her house. In verse 2, the widow says that she has nothing except this one jar of oil. We don't know how big it was. In fact, I don't even know that we know if it was a full jar of oil or if it was half empty or half full. You know, we don't know. But we do know that it was literally all she had to her name. That was all she had of worth besides her life. And Elisha tells her to gather as many empty vessels as she can. And notice his words here were, do not gather a few, meaning you better get a lot. Okay? Again, we don't know how large those vessels were. They might have ranged in size. Honestly, it's irrelevant. We just know that they were all empty, and we know that there were more empty jars than she had of that one jar of oil. But in order to fill those many vessels that she'd gathered, what did she have to do first? Besides gather the empty vessels. She had to empty her own vessel. She had to pour her jar of oil out, and she had to give of herself. Again, God could have probably worked a miracle without any investment on her part. But sometimes miracles need investment. And being filled with God is one of those times where we have to invest. Because honestly, if we're going to be filled with God, we have to be empty first. We have to empty ourselves out. But notice this, when we empty ourselves and get filled with God, it's more than one vessel can hold, which leads me to my next point, which is God will fill an empty vessel beyond what it alone can hold. You see, God wasn't just satisfied with giving the woman enough to pay off her debt. He could have stopped there, right? He could have given her enough to make sure that all of her debts were paid for, that she owed nobody, and left it at that. But no, Elisha tells her to borrow as many empty vessels as she can get her hands on, because God didn't want to just fill her for that moment. He wanted to fill her beyond that to a place where she was filled for the rest of her life. Because what does Elisha say? He says, take that oil and sell it, pay off your debts, and you and your sons live on the rest of it. So clearly she got more than enough. She was overfilled, if you will. Enough to the point where she paid off her debts and she had enough to live on. We don't know for how long. We can only assume for the rest of her life. And this kind of reminds me of a New Testament account of another person being filled who was empty as well. And that is in John 4. And we're talking about the woman at the well. You guys might be familiar with that story. So let's read that real quick. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, give me a drink. For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. And I'm assuming he's probably pointing to the well. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. God is not interested in satisfying only the need. He is interested in changing our life. He's a deep well. And when he fills us, he's going to fill us to the point where we become a fountain of water overflowing that goes into everlasting life. He wants to give us something that's going to last forever, not just for the moment. This woman, like many of us, was trying to fill her own life with wrong things. She was chasing after men. And we know this because later Jesus tells her to go get her husband so he can talk. And she says, I'm not married. And he says, you're right. You've been married 5 times before, and the man you're with now is not even your husband. I'm sure that was probably a stunner moment. And, she was trying to fill her life with relationships. She was empty. And just like we have our things, that was hers. Her thing was men, was relationships, whatever she could do to fill that gap. But when she learned of what Jesus was talking about, she went into the city and she actually brought people to him. In John 4:39 it says, and many of the Samaritans of that city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, he told me all that I ever did. So clearly telling her what she had done without him asking her for it was enough to prompt her to know this guy's different. This guy has something. And it was enough for her to go into the city and actually find others to bring to Jesus. That's the kind of God we serve, the kind that cannot be contained. He fills us beyond that point that one vessel can contain him. Which leads me to my last point, which is when you become filled with him, it will splash over onto others. When the widow filled the jars, she didn't hoard it. She sold it, pay off her debt, and then she was able to live off of it. The woman at the well, she was filled with living water. And because of that, she was able to bring others to Jesus. When God fills you, you can't keep it to yourself. When God fills you, it's going to splash over on others. When God fills you, others are going to get blessed. And when God fills you, others are going to get wet. They can't help it. When you've had a true experience with the living God, you can't help it. People around you are going to know. Yeah, I remember, this isn't a part of my notes either, but I was just thinking about up on the mountain when Moses went and got the Ten Commandments, and when he came off the mountain, he shone the glory of God so brightly that they asked him to put a veil on because it was blinding them. That's the kind of God we serve. He's going to fill you, and people are just going to be like, whoa, 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 something's different about you. Especially when they've known you before. See, here's an interesting thing. In high school, there was this kid in my school. His name was Chris King. Biggest drug addict in school. I mean, like, he would try anything. I can even remember sitting in math class, and he's rolling a ball of herb, weed, whatever. And he's rolling it, like, on top of the desk. And he's like, hey, Bates, you want to stick some of this? Like, dude, it's so good. And I'm like, dude, we're in math class. Who does that, you know? That's how, I mean, he didn't care. And by his senior year, our senior year, we were in the same class, we played soccer together. He disappeared about halfway through the last year. I didn't know where he went. Nobody did. About, I don't know, 6 years later, I ran into him in a coffee shop in downtown Greenville. I was like, that's Chris King. And so I ran over and I was like, Chris, hey man, I haven't seen you since high school. He's like, who are you? I was like, dude, we played soccer together, we math class together, you know, I've been to your house, I don't even know how many times. He's like, man, I don't remember much of high school, so I apologize. And I said, that's cool, man. You know, what are you up to now? He's like, I'm a youth minister. I was like, whoa. How did that happen? And he said, well, I'll give you the short of it. He said, I got kicked out halfway through high school, senior year. My parents kicked me out. I hit the streets. I became like totally addicted to everything I could get my hands on. And I ended up in a homeless shelter. And while I was at this homeless shelter, this preacher came in and preached. And I just started crying. And I went up and I just gave my life to the Lord. And I dropped the drugs the next day. And I was like, dude, that is hot, dude. That is amazing. I was like, you're a completely different person. I said, I can remember in high school, your eyes were so red and you know, you were always hungry, and you were like, I mean, literally, I mean, your eye, you could tell he was changed. There was just something about it, man. And it came off of him like an aura. I mean, it was just like, he was beaming. And he was excited to talk about that. And I said, what church are you at? And he's like, I'm at East North Street Baptist Church. I was like, I know the pastor. That's awesome. And, you know, to this day, he's still a youth minister at that church. We're talking about a guy who had a radical change with God. That's what it means when it splashes out on other people. Because now he got so radically changed, he's like, man, I got to change other people. I need to lead them to the Lord. Youth minister. And that's what he's doing now. He's leading other kids to Christ through the church. And that's just amazing to me, especially since I've known him. You know, he's like, well, what are you doing? I was like, I'm a worship leader. And he's like, well, you're kind of an alkie in high school. I was like, oh, you remember that? All right. You know? But he saw a change in me too, so it was just a really great exchange. High school was a terrible time. A lot of learning took place after that. And but anyway, that's the God we serve. That's the God who can fill us. Let me give you this last illustration here, and you guys might be familiar with this man. His name is D.L. Moody. Ever heard of him? He was a pastor in Chicago and helped found a college called the Moody Bible College, which I think is now called the Moody Bible Institute now. And he was a successful minister. I mean, even probably for today's standards, he was a successful minister. But even by his own admission, he lacked that he had any kind of power in his ministry. One day, 2 women came up to him after church, and they said, we've been praying for you. He said, well, appreciate that, but why don't you pray for the people? And they said, because you need the power of the Spirit. And he's like, I need the power? Why? And in relating the incident many years later, he writes, I thought I had the power. I had the largest congregation in Chicago, and there were many, many conversions. He goes on to say that, in a sense, he was satisfied. He was happy with where he was at. He was in a comfort zone. But these two praying women rocked his boat. And they told him that they were praying for an anointing of the Holy Spirit. Mr. Moody could not get this off his mind, and he wrote, there came a great hunger in my soul. I did not know what it was, and I began to cry out to God as never before. I felt I did not want to live if I could not have this power for service. Reverend Moody began crying out to God to fill him, and he withdrew, he prayed, and he sought it over a period of time. He writes the following, well, one day in the city of New York, oh, what a day. I cannot describe it. I seldom refer to it. It's almost too sacred an experience to name. Paul had an experience of which he never spoke of for 14 years. I can only say that God revealed himself to me, and I had such an experience of his love that I had to ask him to stay his hand. Can you imagine that? Being so overwhelmed by God that you're like, stop. I can't even take anymore. Just stop. That's what he was saying to God. I can't even take it anymore. I can only say that God revealed himself to me. Oh, sorry, I already read that. I went to preaching again, and the sermons were not different. So in other words, he didn't preach anything different. He didn't change the way he preached. He said, I didn't present any new truths. So he didn't create anything new. But yet hundreds more were converted. He said, I would not now be placed back where I was before that experience if you would give me the entire world. You see, he was so filled with God that he recognized that it wasn't even in him that made the difference. He didn't change anything about him. He didn't change what he was doing. It wasn't like he was a bad guy. He wasn't like living in the streets. He wasn't, addicted to anything. He was in a comfortable place. He was doing God's work. But God filled him. And he filled him to a place where he had to tell God to stop. And when he took it to the pulpit, hundreds were converted simply because of the anointing that fell on him. So where does that leave us? Have we been emptied out? Can we say that we're an empty vessel ready to receive God's filling? I believe great things have already begun for our church here. I've spoken to lots of people over the last few weeks since we made the announcement of where we're headed as a church. And almost everyone that I've spoken to said that God has begun moving in their life, aside from the church, like in their own personal life. That things have begun to change for them and that God is moving them into a new season as well. So God's already moving here. I think he's waiting for us to really empty ourselves. If we're going to receive what he's prepared to give us and what he's about to pour out on us, we have to be at a place where we are emptied, where we have given it all to him. And we just emptied it out and said, Lord, okay, I'm ready. I'm empty. Fill me up. If you're longing for a great move in your life, you have to start getting empty. You have to hunger for it. You have to thirst for it. Maybe you're like the widow in the oil, and you know you're in a bad place, and you're crying out already. Empty yourself. Maybe you're like the woman at the well, and you think you're hiding your problems, but deep down you know something's not right, and you're thirsting for something new. Empty yourself. Or maybe you're like Reverend Moody, and you're in a good place. You're in a comfortable place. You're in a happy place. You're doing all the right things, but you either A, haven't had that filling, or B, you're in need of a new filling. Empty yourself. Don't wait for it. What better place than right here? What better time than right now? I mean, you could be like, yeah, I want his filling, and then I have to think about it. Who thinks about it? Do you think Moses thought about it when he just walked up on the mountaintop? No, he just went, right? He went toward it, and God poured it out. You know? But I have to give a word of warning. If you empty yourself completely and you cry out to God to be filled, He will do it. But you're not going to be able to contain it. And another word of warning to those who are around that person. You better watch out, because you might get wet. And that's not a bad thing. Are you wanting to be filled, or are you wanting to get a little splash over on you? Release the